SMNI. Balita Totoo.
Good evening. You're watching SMNI. This is Business and Politics. I'm your host, Dante Klinkang. Our guest this evening is Ambassador Franz Mellbin of the Royal Danish Embassy in Manila. Prior to his assignment here, he served as ambassador to Japan, Afghanistan, and United Arab Emirates. He was also permanent representative in the International Renewable Energy Agency and had served in senior diplomatic positions in Denmark's foreign ministry. Our topic tonight will cover European issues that are linked to the Philippines. They include the certification of Filipino seafarers, economic relations with Denmark and its neighbors, renewable energy development, and European foreign policy interests in the Indo-Pacific. To put it all together, we will ask Ambassador Mellbin, how do we strengthen ties between the Philippines and Europe? Ambassador, please. Ambassador Mellbin, welcome to Business and Politics, and thank you for being so accessible to the Manila Times and me for interviews.
Well, it's always great to talk to you.
And the last time we talked, there were a lot of hanging issues with regard to our seafarers, but there have been some major developments since then. If I were to describe it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that we sort of got a reprieve. Is that correct? Would that be a better way to... The issues are not exactly resolved, but there were enough things done to continue doing the reforms that were needed so that our Filipino seafarers can continue working in European flag vessels. Is that how you see it?
Yes, and very importantly, the certifications will still be valid, which was absolutely essential.
Okay.
So, but there were also promises made that need to be followed up.
Okay.
And what the industry really needs here in the Philippines is to have more stability now.
Okay.
So there was a lot of uncertainty created because of the outstanding issues and what would happen with certifications. Now the Philippine government made a lot of promises. There's still implementation left to be done.
Right.
Get that right, create stability around the industry, and make sure the Philippines still is seen as an attractive place to hire seafarers.
Right. So what we saw from the palace was this new coordination between Marina and CHED, and I guess to a certain extent the Labor Department and Department of Migrant Workers. But Marina now, as we understand it, will take lead, right? Mm-hmm. There were also some schools closed, and then CHED promised to work with Marina on designing curriculum. Are these the things that were most urgent? Are you happy with the changes that you've seen so far? And then maybe moving forward, what are the things that Denmark, or maybe to a large extent Europe, would like to see the Philippines do so that they feel safe working with Filipino seafarers?
There was a real problem with subpar schools.
Okay.
And this was not just a problem for us, it was also a problem for the Filipino seafarers who didn't get the education they were paying for.
Okay.
And I think that's sometimes lost in the discussion.
Right.
That people pay a lot for this education, and it should be
nothing.
high quality.
Yeah.
And
just a piece of paper.
It's a piece of paper, and there was even this risk that it might become worthless. So I think that's a very important issue. So closing those schools who are not delivering was a very important thing. Improving the curriculum, but also following up on the schools.
Okay.
So this is a very important part of the promise, that there will be a review process, and it will actually, work. There have been reviews before, a review model, but it wasn't working very well. And concentrating more of the effort around Marina seems to be a good way to resolve some of the issues that were, but we're quite optimistic. Now there's also opportunity here. So it's not just, the threat of losing the certificates.
Right.
The shipping industry is undergoing a lot of changes, and the Philippines is well positioned to sort of grab the opportunity of some of those changes, like the whole question of greening the industry.
Okay.
which will require, new kinds of fuels,
Right.
new ways of running ships. So that's one example. Another one is female seafarers,
Okay.
where the Philippines certainly could be one of the countries where you could find female seafarers,
Okay.
which is something that the industry is asking for.
Now, before these announcements, were there difficulties in processing papers of Filipinos going to Denmark? Was that an issue? Is that different now? Or are we seeing an easier process, I guess, for deployment of our seafarers for Europe? What's the situation maybe in your embassy?
Yeah. For the processing of papers, it's not a difficult issue.
It's not the issue.
No, it's very institutionalized,
Okay.
and both the sending and receiving end of the system are very well attuned to what needs to be done.
Okay.
The real issue was, are the certificates going to be valid?
Right.
And that's not just a question for Europe, because a lot of countries globally rely on the European certification system, and their laws refer to the European system.
I see.
So if the Philippines fell out of that, it would be much more difficult for Filipino seafarers to get jobs on international ships.
Right.
So in that sense, it was very important.
Yeah.
What we will see, however, is again an opportunity where Denmark and the Philippines will work together. This is a thing that has been agreed between Marina and the Danish Maritime Authority to actually make seafarer books digital.
Oh, okay.
Now, the Philippines has a system for that, so you actually have a digitalized seafarer book.
Okay.
And Denmark has a digitized version for the shipping companies.
Okay.
And
What is that? I'm sorry. I'm a little
Well,
bit, is that a log that?
Yeah, a seafarer's book is a very important document
Okay.
if you're a seafarer, and
Okay.
it's it's like a passport. You can actually
I
travel
see.
on it.
Okay.
And it sort of tells where you've been and who you are employed by,
Okay.
and which ships you are linked to, etc.
Right.
So it's a very important document.
Okay.
And it allows you to travel forth and back.
Okay.
To sort of board the ships wherever they are.
Right.
And having that digitized would reduce friction for the seafarers and for the shipping companies. And Denmark and the Philippines is now on the back of this clarification of the certification issue, going to work together to try to show the world that you can have a digitalized seafarer system. So again, yes, there is more work to be done, but there are also some opportunities, and Denmark wants to help the Philippines see some of those opportunities.
Right. I wanted to ask you about that. Does the inspection include some European officials accompanying ARCHED officials inspecting, or is it more of a capacity building effort where you try to pass on learnings and technology and best practices, or is it a mixture of both?
It's a mixture, but mostly we rely on the reporting coming from the Philippines itself. But there are also visits from Europe to here.
Yeah.
So it's a combination of those two. And really, when it comes to the capacity building side, it's about improving the seafarers' education. And we can see several European countries stepping up their efforts, trying to help the Philippines establish, a more modernized curriculum in this area, which will make the seafarers more attractive to the global market.
Right.
So,
what other countries are competing with Filipinos for those positions in Europe? Indonesia, I hear, is a big one.
Yes, but it's not just Indonesia. And this is why it was so important, what I said before, there needs to be a more stable situation surrounding Filipino seafarers, because there are a lot of manning agencies, which are quite large operations here, hiring thousands of people and sending them around globally. And, that's a costly business to build and operate. And if people are uncertain whether or not Filipinos can actually go abroad and work, they're simply going to scale down their manning operations here, and there'll be less options for Filipino seafarers. So the big competitors, one is Indonesia, another is India.
Okay.
There are also some that have dropped out, like a lot of Ukrainians and Russians used to be, but they're not there because of
what's happening in the war.
Because of the war. And what is also happening now, and which is important for the Philippines to be aware of, is that the big large shippers are spreading their bets.
Okay.
And this is a side effect from the Ukraine war, where Russia came in and attacked Ukraine, and those groups fell out because the big shippers sort of saw themselves in a vulnerable situation. What if, for whatever reason, the Philippines would fall out of the equation, or Indonesia or India? It's too big an impact.
I see.
So the competition will be going up. There will be more countries with international seafaring.
I see. Now, Denmark is obviously a maritime country. I hear that that sector contributes something like 20% to your GDP, which is quite substantial. The Philippines is trying to, I think, come to grips that it's a maritime nation as well. I think recently there have been calls for a maritime agenda and for our policymakers to look at their maritime resources and maritime policies. How would, if you were to give advice, right, in crafting that maritime agenda so that it's, as productive as Denmark's maritime industry, how could we go about it? Because seafarers doesn't, the maritime is just more, not just the seafarers. It's a much bigger area, right? So
yeah. Well, I think the Philippines, you are an archipelago, and you should have a natural affinity to have a strong shipping industry.
Right.
In Denmark, we have what we call the Blue Water policy, which is a broad-based paper which describes a broad base also of the political spectrum, which tries to look at how to improve the competitiveness of the Danish shipping industry. And that is a long-standing policy document. It gets revised for, every 3, 4, 5 years when needed. And the industry and the government are in constant, interaction about how does this work. The trade unions also play a role in that. So I think, building a national consensus on how do we make the shipping industry competitive, because it's not just about, as you said, one thing. It's not just about having seafarers. You need to have port structure, that infrastructure that works. You need to link that port structure up to land-based transportation. You need to make sure that if you want to be a shipbuilding nation, that you have wharfs and people who are able to work in those wharfs that are qualified, welding and all these things. So you really need to look carefully at how can we become competitive and work your way out of that. And there are a lot of regulations also here. So red tape, for example, making it more attractive can be important.
Yeah, you made that comment at our last event that Filipinos have invented or seems to have innovated red tape.
Yeah, new ways of doing red tape. That's true.
But in most countries, the people in the maritime sector tend to be, based on my observation, in the lower classes, right?
Yeah.
Not just in the Philippines, but in many other countries.
Yeah.
But that's not the case in Denmark. I mean, so
no, that's true.
How do you change that mindset? Do we begin with education? Did you have a maritime agenda? Did it take that, or it was simply just a way of life for you guys that that became the spring well now for all sorts of policies and national strategies that you came up with?
It is true that one of the things that differentiate Danish shipping industry is that it's been possible to attract some of the very best and brightest into that. And this is because some of the two leading companies, which were the East Asiatic company, ÖK, it was called in Danish, and Maersk company, they were deemed two of the most prestigious places to work.
I see.
So even if you were a lawyer or a high-end engineer or, accountant or whatever, it was deemed, very attractive to work in these companies. It's not like that in most of the rest of the world.
Right.
Now, you can't rely on history alone.
Sure.
And the Danish shipping industry understands that. So they have asked the government to have a maritime university grade degree developed.
I see.
So, and that is in place now. So now we are sort of preparing for more intense competition when it comes to talent. And, a company like Maersk is doing a lot to widen its talent base. Also globally looking outside of Denmark a lot. I mean, they employ a lot of highly talented foreigners, including Filipinos. So it's really getting the right talent in, making the workspace attractive for them. And I think because of the changes that are happening in the shipping industry,
Okay.
you'll see more digitization, you'll see more integration between land and sea.
I see.
You'll see less reliance on the people on the ship, so to say, and
Okay.
more on, the managing the complexity of value chains, stuff like that. All this will attract higher end, more qualified workers into that industry. And there will be competition for talent. There is
Sure.
a lot of competition for talent.
Sure. Well, very exciting times. We'll take a quick break. We're talking to Ambassador Mellbin of the Danish Embassy. This is Business and Politics. So please stay tuned.
Opening to multipolarity was taking place in East Asia, away from the Western memories in which liberalism and Marxism were both embedded. The seed was Singapore, and the carrier, the China of Deng Xiaoping. What I find interesting here is you considered Singapore as the seed of multipolarity. Why is that?
He understood that the struggle of decolonization was not the way to liberate. He used capital finances and he built Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore planted the seed of de-Westernization, and of course, Deng Xiaoping was in China, and China is not a small country.
Mm-hmm.
So through 40 years, 45 years, look what happened. Capitalism is not an abstract universal. It was until it escaped, the monster escaped the lab. China is capitalist, but it's not neoliberal, because neoliberal is intended to homogenize the world, and still the North Atlantic is trying to do that.
But Professor McNor, can't we think of freedom as a matter of context? Or is freedom a transcendental idea devoid from its context?
Freedom cannot be given. Freedom has to be taken. So we have to ask when and why and to the benefit of whom the concept of knowledge came to be what it is now.
Watch Professor Walter Mignono's Part 2 interview on Statecraft with Sas Rogando Sasod this Saturday, April 22 at 8 p.m. only here on SMNI.
Welcome back to SMNI. This is Business and Politics. We're talking to Danish Ambassador Mellbin. Sir, let's circle back a bit and talk more broadly about Philippines and Denmark and Philippines in Europe. There have been some developments, as I understand it, since the last time we talked. I know there were a lot of exploratory things. I think last time we talked, we just saw the visit of President Marcos to Belgium, to visit the European Union representing ASEAN. But what are some of those developments that you have heard and would like to talk about?
Well, I'm happy to say that we're on a roll, so to say, between Denmark and the Philippines, and the amount of investments that are coming to the Philippines is going up a lot, and we have a number of investors who are looking more carefully at the Philippines now.
Okay.
So certainly the Marcos administration has been sending strong signals to the market, and we can see Denmark is responding to that in a positive way, and we're very happy for that. And there was a very large investment announced. So this is a group of investors led by a Danish company then,
okay.
But not only Danish money, so to say, but a group of investors.
Led by a Danish
company who's the largest sort of investor in renewable energy in the world.
Wow. Okay.
Who will invest $5 billion into wind energy sector here in the Philippines.
Wow.
And that's a lot, because the Philippines gets about $10 billion in FDIs every year.
Okay.
So just
5 billion is just
$5 billion.
quite,
It's a huge chunk coming in, and in a very important sector, because the country is facing a power crisis.
Sure.
And this is offshore wind farms.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And the timeline could be short. It depends
Okay.
a little on the red tape we talked about before. And I have this thing I said to the president, you know, cut the red tape and we'll cut the red ribbons. So hopefully he and I can stand there and look at the inauguration of the first offshore wind farm in the Philippines together.
Well, is there an area in the Philippines that have been identified, or you're still going to do some wind mapping, or you generally know where these wind farms are going to be?
There are concession areas that have been identified,
Okay.
but I'd like to leave it to the investor to point out, you know, this is
Sure.
where we're going to start the building. And there are also, I mean, there's still things that need
Finalized,
to be
right.
finalized, but the commitment was there, was signed
Yeah.
between the company, Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, and Secretary Lutilia. And it was a great occasion.
And we were talking earlier about Secretary Lutilia. He's traveling to Denmark.
Yes, he is.
And you'll be accompanying. Can you talk about that trip? What's the purpose of it, and what we will see from it?
Yeah, it's a large delegation, broad basis of Filipino government, but also private sector actors who all are interested in the power sector.
Okay.
And there's a large wind power conference called Wind Europe going on in Copenhagen. And they will use that trip to inform themselves more about wind energy, how it can be used, and especially offshore wind, because now the Philippines is going to move heavily into offshore wind. Going to be an important part of your future power profile. And it's simply a good opportunity also to have political level discussions, not just with his Danish counterpart,
I see.
but there'll be a lot of other ministers there who he can then meet with and talk about these things and how do you manage it. There are also questions like how do you manage the distribution system, what about tariffs, what are the best kind of incentives,
I see.
all kinds of issues. And I think that it's a great learning opportunity to see, you know, this is what one country has done, but
see.
also to hear from the whole industry, because it is actually a global conference,
I see.
what is happening in the wind sector.
Now, will we see any significant signings or meetings on the sidelines besides the things going on in the conference itself?
Well, we hope that some of these meetings will be
Crush for
quite
me.
important, but as of now, we don't have any signings planned. We
Okay.
had this very large signing the other day that I talked about before, which is a very large sort of chunk. But there are definitely some very important meetings taking place with people who see a future of both investing and working with renewables here in the Philippines.
Now, you have a background in renewable energy.
Yeah.
You were permanent representative to the Renewables Agency. Europe is sort of in an interesting situation now because of what's going on in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the lessons learned there that you think the Philippines should take note of? As you know, we are at the sort of like at the ground floor of this development, right? Moving forward, knowing your experience now, what would be the best way to proceed, from a policy framework standpoint? What would you recommend?
Well, basically, I recommend, less dependency on external actors in your energy policies.
Okay.
And your energy supply. The more you can do with Filipino geothermal, Filipino sun, Filipino wind, whatever you can do yourself, Filipino gas, is better.
Okay.
Because being reliant on external sources for your energy is a risk.
Okay.
You also need to diversify your energy production as much as you can. And the Philippines does have some big advantages here, because you can do a lot. You can do onshore, offshore wind, you can do solar, you can do geothermal, you can do biomass, you can do waste to energy. You might be able to do nuclear if SMR technology evolves in a positive way. So you have a lot of options, and combining this will help you build, you can also do hydro, will help you build a very robust system and also deliver cheaper power to your industry and to the people, because unfortunately the Filipinos are paying far too much for their power, their electricity. It's a real problem, and the price needs to come down.
Right. What about financing it? Of course, building these things will take resources. right? What are some of the lessons they think the Philippines can learn from Denmark's past and maybe Europeans' past, and how to go about it? There seems to be this mentality about going for public-private partnerships. Is that the right way to go? Because the critics of that would say, we should be looking at our own ways, maybe float our own bonds, or maybe even set up a wealth fund, right, to fund these things. What do you think? I mean, how can we go about it?
I think whatever you can finance yourself, you should reserve for those things that private equity will not finance.
I see.
Because the lack of infrastructure and the need to provide more robust infrastructure and better infrastructure is huge in this country.
Okay.
You need bridges, you need roads,
Sure.
you need metro, you need harbors, you need
Sure.
airports, you need power plants. You just need a lot. So I think the smart strategy for your country is get foreign investors or domestic investors to come up with private equity and put in where it's possible, where it's fiscally viable,
Right.
and reserve the government's own money and possibly potentially a sovereign wealth fund for those investments that either are not attractive for the private sector or where the payback time is so long, we're talking past 30 years,
Yeah.
where it's not really viable to go with private investors.
Yeah.
So you reserve that capital for that. And if you look, I use this, this comparison. If you build one more kilometer of high-speed railway in China,
Okay.
it will not boost Chinese economy because they build a crazy amount of infrastructure.
Thousands of miles, yeah.
But you build 1 kilometer of metro in this country, the payback is tremendous. I mean, it's a great investment for your future. So, the former government had the slogan, build, build, build,
Yes.
and now it's build more, better.
Yeah.
I think these are good slogans because it will really help raise the standard of living. It will make life for ordinary Filipinos easier. It will make the country richer in the long run.
Right. Now, just one more question on the renewables, because some of the critics say that the alternatives or the clean energy is not exactly carbon free, right? That there is a carbon footprint to even building the windmills, right? Is there a better way? Is that a valid argument? Is there a better way to go about it? Knowing, because the argument there, if you point that out, is that you don't want to have one race to perdition and then switch it over to another one, that also has cost, right? And are there any lessons learned there from your country, you think?
I've heard this argument, but I think it misses the point because, of course, there's a carbon footprint. I mean,
Sure.
you and I sitting here breathing
There's
has a
carbon
carbon footprint. So, it's part of human existence.
Yeah.
And it's also part of the existence of a windmill or a solar panel or whatever. What you need to do is to calculate what is the payback time of that carbon footprint.
Right.
And for a modern windmill, the new ones, it's about 3 to 4 months.
Okay.
3 to 4 months. So after 3 to 4 months, the clean energy it's producing has already compensated for the carbon footprint that went into, the construction of the mill and everything. So these windmills, they typically have a lifespan of at least 15 years, typically more than that, but at least 15 years. So if you're talking about those kind of timelines and you're talking a few months to pay back the carbon footprint, it's a good equation.
It's worth it. Yeah.
It's worth it.
Are there other technologies from Denmark that you think would be good here? Because you mentioned there are so many things that there's solar, there's biomass, there's a number of geothermal. Are there Danish technologies or Danish industries you think would be interested in serving a market like the Philippines where the energy cost is very
definitely.
high?
We see a lot of potential in several areas. So we have Danish companies that are interested in the wind sector, as I mentioned before, solar, biomass, waste to energy. These are all things people are interested in, or even hydro. But maybe most interesting, we also have some SMR technology, small modular reactors, nuclear. This is emerging technology. Nobody can sell you an SMR right now,
Right.
but there are people working on this. And in Denmark, we have a company that has a model that would be highly applicable to the Philippines. So I think it's very promising, and it's probably the first SMR technology that will be commercially available.
Wow.
And we're talking about several years before other SMRs will be commercially available. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this develops. I know it's part of Secretary Lutilia's program and the delegation's program to also learn a little more about this technology. This could be an interesting option. And, there is sometimes this debate, nuclear versus renewables.
Right.
But as I said before, we shouldn't look at it as
As
just
one,
one
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
We need a range of technologies to work together because
Right.
then we have a more robust and resilient energy system.
Right.
And you could easily combine SMRs with an extension of renewables. So what the Filipino need is reliable, cheap, and abundant power.
Right, and less red tape.
And that comes with less red tape.
All right, we'll take another quick break. This is Business and Politics. We're talking to Ambassador Mellbin. Welcome back to Business and Politics. We're talking to Danish Ambassador Mellbin. Sir, it's a very interesting discussion about these technologies. Are there other areas of climate change mitigation that the Philippines and Denmark and maybe even Europe can work together on? What are some of those areas that are possible?
I definitely think there's a lot to do, and there's also emerging cooperation in these areas. I'll give a couple of examples of that. But the climate issue is one that's very important to Denmark, but
Okay.
it's also very important for the Philippines because you
important
are
for the world,
suffering
yeah.
the consequences and one of the countries that are most vulnerable to
Right.
climate change. So I think, it's important to look at what can we do back in our own country, but how can we also help the Philippines be part of the solution and help mitigate the threats that it is facing itself.
Right.
So right now we have about 30 people from Quezon City in Copenhagen to talk to the municipality of Copenhagen. Both cities are part of what you call the C40 group, some of the largest cities in the world working together to become climate neutral. Copenhagen has pledged to become the first climate neutral capital in the world. Hopefully going to happen in a couple of years' time. That's the plan at least. Quezon City wants to learn from that. And there are a lot of issues that go into that. So one of them is like food waste.
Food waste, okay.
People don't think about food waste as a climate issue, but there is actually a huge climate footprint to food waste.
Wow.
And in Denmark, to my own surprise, I have to say, we have reduced through targeted measures food waste with almost 30%. That's a lot. And
30%?
In only a few years. Only a few years. And that has a huge benefit on the climate footprint that you have. So, trying to inspire and help people look at how can this be done. We are having this, or Copenhagen has this very high ambition, also because it's been possible to neutralize its CO2 emissions in its power system. This is also due to our sector coupling, where we combine power and energy, so we get a higher degree of efficiency and lower prices. For something like central cooling and electricity, you combine those two, you can save a lot of money, it's more efficient. So I think those kind of solutions can help inspire decision makers in the Philippines also to find solutions that are applicable to your country and to this place. There's also an opportunity when it comes to things like waste to energy.
Okay.
Where you can use waste. Today, waste goes into landfills.
Okay.
But it can be used much more productively and also reduce CO2 through incineration. So you convert that to power, which would be, a better solution.
Yeah.
Wastewater treatment. We can also showcase in Denmark how we actually harvest energy from wastewater, so it's a surplus. It's quite amazing. We have two such plants in Denmark, yes. Most countries, it's very expensive to treat wastewater, but in Denmark we now have two wastewater plants that are making a profit, and they don't call themselves, wastewater plants or sewage facilities. They're now resource harvesting companies. It's very interesting. So, that kind of inspiration can be very important and I think helpful. And we need to exchange good ideas.
Yeah.
There are lots of great ideas out there around the world, and just making decision makers aware this is possible.
Yeah.
This is viable.
Yes.
You can actually do this.
Right.
I think is very, very important.
So are there going to be high-level meetings? Are there going to be conferences? What's in the calendar?
Well, there'll be a very big conference here very soon, where the Philippines has agreed to host a ASEAN Plus conference for the IMO. So, the IMO countries in this region.
It's the International Maritime Organization.
Yeah, where thank you so for that. The International Maritime Organization on green shipping.
Okay.
And that will be both green shipping internationally, but also coastal shipping.
That's very interesting. And people talking about electric cars, and Denmark's talking about electric ships.
Yes, and you delivered one from one of your wharfs here. You delivered.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, one of the largest electrical powered ferries.
Wow.
Was delivered to Denmark not long ago.
Wow.
Not long ago.
Wow.
From the Philippines. Philippines. So
not many people know that we have that capability.
The Philippines can too. I have a great belief in the Philippines. So there will be this large conference here. There will be maybe 150 people discussing solutions and options, and we're very happy Denmark and the Philippines partnering on this.
Right.
And we hope to carry this discussion further from the Philippines and Denmark into the IMO.
I see.
Because we really need international cooperation here. The shipping industry is a substantial part of CO2 emissions globally, and reducing that needs to be part of a global way of reducing our CO2 level. International shipping first, but coastal shipping can also do it.
Sure. We were talking about the seafarers earlier. Yeah. Would this require a new discipline or a new area of study for those wanting to be workers in the maritime industry? And does it take a lot of investments? I mean, a lot of equipment to teach these things? What's your experience in Denmark?
I don't think it takes a lot of new equipment, but it does take developing new curricula to accommodate this. So when a battery-powered vehicle will operate differently.
Yes.
It will have different kind of security issues. Sure. It will need to store energy in a different way. Yeah. There are issues there, or rather, issues, but there are different modes of operation. And seafarers have to, understand those differences and accommodate new technologies. And that's when I talked before. There are also opportunities now in this discussion you've had on the certification in developing the curriculum for the future. And I definitely encourage, and I know it's a part of the ongoing discussion, move in that direction, because the industry will move in that direction.
Right. Is there discussion between your embassy and our Commission on Higher Education on maybe to see what's best practices around there in terms of maritime education?
We've had that discussion with Marina,
Okay,
and the ones who are leading from the Danish side are really our shipping companies.
I see.
So the shipping companies are, and we are helping them with that,
Right.
but they have the expertise.
Right,
The embassy doesn't
right.
have a lot of
Right,
expertise,
right.
but these shipping companies have. They are very interested in assisting and supporting the Philippines in developing their seafarers for the future, because Denmark expects we will be at the forefront of the reshaping of the kind of fuels and systems that are used in international shipping.
Now, can I go back to what you said a while ago about food waste and how maybe there's a better way of disposing it than you guys do it in a way that you actually harness the energy from burning it. In the Philippines, there was some resistance to. There was even a law. I think it was called the Clean Air Act that prohibited the use of incinerators. But incinerator technology has progressed since then, and I assume that the ones that are used in Europe now are not the ones that we see in the past that emit these harmful gases, but are
and
can you talk
and
about that?
everything. It's really about having high enough temperatures.
Okay.
So the management of how you incinerate is very important.
Okay.
That technology has evolved a lot.
Right.
So you have very safe forms of waste to energy, and it is a good way of producing energy. But for the Philippines, also very important because you have a real waste problem.
Right.
And the landfills are a disaster waiting
That's
to
right.
happen. It pains my heart.
Right.
When you're out there in the countryside. I was in Negros Occidental here the other day, and you're driving out there in the countryside, and then suddenly you see this hole in the ground, and and you're just thinking that's happening in a lot of places, and it's poison. It's going to poison your earth. It's going to poison your water. It's not good.
Yeah. Well, I'm just wondering if this is a case for the Philippines where, a well-intended law was meant to protect the environment, except that, there are rapid developments in technology that maybe it should now consider and maybe revisit those laws.
I think that should definitely be revisited. And I know Quezon City, this is one thing they're going to look at. Quezon City is interested in looking at waste to energy.
Does Denmark have technology that we can look at? Or?
Yes, we do. We were the first to do waste to energy in a large scale.
Okay.
We do it less now because we have transcended from that.
Okay.
But I think where the Philippines is right now, you could win a lot by doing waste to energy. And it's Filipino resources. You are substituting imported energy with Filipino energy. Way to go.
And the other thing you talked about was wastewater. And I noticed in the U.S. that this has become sort of an ancillary business for the sewage companies. I mean, there's a link between that and agriculture. Yeah. And I remember seeing some reports of how they were actually trying to market some of those treated waste to farming to farming communities. Is there such a thing in Denmark as well that is working, or were you thinking of something else when you talk about making?
Well, in Denmark, the wastewater treatment plants are typically independent government-owned entities.
I see.
So we don't have
private sector. Yeah.
Private sector. So these are like semi-government run enterprises, and it's worked well for us, this model. And what these plants, these highly advanced plants, are doing is that they're treating the water as they should, and then they are taking out the nutrients from the wastewater and processing that into fertilizer and other things, which then they sell off.
Right.
And the processes they are using also allow them to do bio gases, which they then can use to harvest the energy that is in surplus of what the plant itself uses.
Right.
And that's also then a surplus for the wastewater plant.
So a number of different uses.
Yeah.
We're ending on an unusual note here, but we'll be right back with Ambassador Mellbin. This is Business and Politics. Please stay tuned.
Good evening, Philippines. My name is Sas Rogando Sasot, and this is Statecraft. For over 500 years, Western civilization has had a profound influence.
The opening to multipolarity was taking place in East Asia, away from the Western memories in which liberalism and Marxism were both embedded. The seed was Singapore, and the carrier, the China of Deng Xiaoping. What I find interesting here is you considered Singapore as the seed of multipolarity. Why is that?
He understood that the struggle of decolonization was not the way to liberate. He used capital finances and he built Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore planted the seed of de-Westernization, and of course, Deng Xiaoping was in China, and China is not a small country. So through 40 years, 45 years, look what happened. Capitalism is not an abstract universal. It was until it escaped, the monster escaped the lab. China is capitalist, but it's not neoliberal, because neoliberalism is intended to homogenize the world, and still the North Atlantic is trying to do that.
But Professor McNor, can't we think of freedom as a matter of context? Or is freedom a transcendental idea devoid from its context?
Freedom cannot be given. Freedom has to be taken. So we have to ask when and why and to the benefit of whom the concept of knowledge came to be what it is now.
Watch Professor Walter Mignolo's Part 2 interview on Statecraft with Sas Rogando Sasot this Saturday, April 22 at 8 p.m. only here on SMNI.
Welcome back to Business and Politics. We're talking to Ambassador Mellbin. Sir, there's a lot of opportunities, obviously, and there are a lot of things, I would say, irons in the fire, as they would say, between our country and yours. But of course, we're not the only two countries that exist in the world. There are many things going on in this part of the region that concerns the world, I think. The rivalry or the competition between the U.S. and China, for one. Of course, we have our own problems with China, with our territorial issues. But how concerned is Denmark and Europe in general about what's going on in the larger geopolitical region? Do you think it will disrupt some of these opportunities that we have been talking about?
Well, I hope they won't. The real headline here is uncertainty.
Okay.
So there's a lot more focus on the Indo-Pacific and including on the Philippines. There's a lot more focus on the Taiwan issue, what
Sure.
China is doing, and of course, how they're positioning themselves towards the US, Korea, Japan, Australia, etc. So the focus is there, and you can feel the interest in Europe for this. A lot of discussions are ongoing. Now, when it comes to the risk side, it's really about how do you manage that uncertainty that we are living with. And there are no easy answers to that.
Yes.
We have to have a very adaptive approach. But part of that approach is also, we can't just stop everything or not do anything
Sure.
because of this uncertainty. We're going to have to live with that and incorporate it into the way we sort of de-risk. So I think that surprisingly, you can say, if you look at the Danish companies, what they are doing now is they're doing less China. Some are doing no China. Some are doing more careful China. Some are just doing, we'll do what we're doing in China now, but start doing more elsewhere. There's sort of different variables on that. But then they're looking also outside of China. And that will benefit, southeastern
The Philippines, maybe?
countries, including the Philippines for sure. So this is, good news for the Philippines. Then you could ask, okay, what about the uncertainty there is if there's a big confrontation? But the reality is, if there's a big confrontation between China and the US, we're talking about global impact.
Right.
And there's no rock to hide under.
Right. Everyone's going to be affected.
Everybody's going to be affected.
Yeah.
Everybody's going to be affected badly. It doesn't matter if you put your bet on the Philippines or Indonesia or Japan or the US
Right.
or Denmark or whatever. It's just going to be very, very bad. So I think in that sense, people have become more robust, and it's very interesting to see how risk is perceived very differently, both politically, but also economically.
Yeah.
So things that previously would have had a huge impact on, stock markets, and you
Sure.
could see, wild swings, and we are seeing wild swings for sure, but
Right.
but for other reasons. But there's quite a lot of what I would call geopolitical robustness, because people are in the mood. Anything can happen tomorrow.
Sure.
So really, when I talk to global Danish companies about geopolitical risks, what I hear them telling me is, well, we're trying to spread our risks.
I see.
Everybody's trying to spread the risks because there's no real place to hide, but you just need to make sure you're not dependent on one thing happening.
Sure.
And Philippines will be part of that equation.
Sure. You know China more than most people. You've served in that country for many years in your embassy in Beijing. How do you see things now? Are the Philippines strengthening its defense and security cooperation with the United States, and you see a knee-jerk reaction in China that also has to do with what's going on between the U.S. and Taiwan. Are you worried, or do you think that this is sort of just up to par? Based on what's happened in the past. How concerned should we be now?
I think we need to be concerned because some of the language we're hearing has changed, and that's not good.
Okay.
China consistently says to every one of us, "Don't rock the boat."
Sure.
But I look
But
at
they rock the boat.
I look at my own country,
Yeah.
and I can just say, it's very difficult for me to see we rock the boat in any way,
Yeah.
wherever.
Sure.
But still, there's also some finger pointing going on against
Sure.
Denmark. And meanwhile, the Chinese are, becoming much more willing to come out with aggressive language or claims. That just makes everybody uneasy.
Yeah.
And putting timelines, timelines are very dangerous in politics
Yes.
because one day they'll come back to bite you, and
Yes.
what happens then? So when I was in China, it's a while ago, late 90s, and I went to talk to the Taiwanese bureau, as they had it at that time. And the feeling there was, we have time enough. As long as nobody rocks the boat, we can wait. We can wait
This is
30,
status quo?
50, 100
Yeah.
years, whatever. Don't rock the boat. That was very important, no steps that look like recognize Taiwan as a country and all that. And I think everybody's okay with that. I really don't see anybody wanting to change that. So I do question some of the messaging we're getting from China right now. Is it really helpful? Also, seen from the Chinese perspective,
Yeah.
you're also pushing people to reevaluate what does it mean not to rock the boat if you're sort of seeing these headwinds. So I do think that there is a heightened state. I think the world thinks there's a heightened tension. It needs to be managed carefully, and hopefully the U.S. and China can, slowly start to get down
Yeah.
in a different height.
Yeah.
But it's not certain it's going to happen. You
Sure.
know, we don't know it's going to happen, and we have changes, political changes quite significant changes in China with Xi. You know, how long time is going to be president for life or whatever. And we have political uncertainty in the U.S. You know, there may be a change of government there that could be quite impactful. It's very bad to get into that, you know, fray coming from a high friction level. Let's get that down. We all need it. And it doesn't really help anybody what's happening right now, if you ask me.
What do you make of China's proposal for a peace plan in Ukraine? That seems to have gotten the attention of some people in Europe, at least the French President Emmanuel Macron. And of course, he was qualified in saying it was a good thing. But, you know, there were some other European officials who said something similar. But, of course, many others are very skeptical. What's your take? Do you think there's something to it? I mean, a lot of people are not giving China credit for bringing Saudi and Iran to back into diplomatic relations. But, you know, is there something here that we should look at? You know, China's proposal for peace in Ukraine?
I'm sure China could play a positive role, but what they have said so far does not seem to be very helpful, because there are some key elements that are missing. And we need to see other kind of language coming out from Beijing for it to be, you know, helpful when it comes to the Ukrainian crisis. And, you know, not being willing to name Russia as the clear aggressor.
It's one of those things.
Already that is you know, it doesn't work that way. You have to be clear about what is the situation, and if you're not willing to take those steps, you know, can you then be seen as a neutral arbitrator between a country that was attacked by an aggressor, Russia? No, you cannot. You know, you have to be clear about what is the situation. You can do that diplomatically. You don't have to go out publicly. But they have public messaging, and the public messaging is not very helpful, so it's a little difficult. Now, Macron definitely saw a geopolitical interest in keeping the door open for China to play a more constructive role. And, you know, there can be utility in that, but the communication around that maybe was,
the problem,
less... afforded less clarity than some people would have liked to.
Well, some people said mixed messaging, because he was talking about de-risking, at the same time bringing some 50-something odd French businessmen to China with him. So
well, the world is complex, and there are no straightforward solutions to any of these dilemmas. So communication comes with a high premium. And if you don't communicate very clearly what your intentions are, then, you know, people will draw their own conclusions. There could be misunderstandings. And I think, you know, maybe some more clarity on communication would have been helpful from both sides. Both sides. We could also use that from the Chinese side, frankly.
But would you say that there's also some clarity needed from what Europe's position actually is with regard to China? Because, as I said earlier, there are some people who are, I think the word you use is de-risking, right? And but there are others in Europe who are maybe looking at, well, maybe decoupling altogether, much more consistent, I think, with the present U.S. direction right now, which have, you know, both have, you know, problems with it. But what do you think is the prevailing preference in Europe? Is it de-risking, decoupling, or something else?
The prevailing answer is confusion. So we do have policies. You know, you can look up their policy papers, China, Indo-Pacific, etc. But the real issue is, you know, how do we act politically in view of those strategy papers? And there's a gap right now between, you know, where the politicians are and where the strategy papers are, and this needs to be ironed out.
But has there been a fundamental change in Europe's position, or are we just...
Ukraine changed everything. Ukraine changed everything. And you will see a reassessment. And speaking about my own country, you know, we had policy papers come out over the last years, too many probably, on foreign policy. I think we had 4 over the last 6-7 years, something like that. which is a lot when you talk about foreign policy. And now we're going to have a new one because our now foreign minister said very clearly, we need to have a much more realistic and pragmatic foreign policy. And we just can't do the policy we've thought we could do before because it's not in tune with where the world is and where realities have moved. And I think that's true for a lot of European countries. And we haven't found, the perfect answer to that. There are, there's what I would call an emerging consensus in Europe where 27 partners, it's a puzzle piece to get everything to come together. 28 when you count the commission. So, it's really how do we get those priorities aligned, and then once we have that, we can act very, strongly and decisively. And we have done so when it comes to a lot of issues pertaining Ukraine.
Yes.
But the problem with Ukraine, or the challenge, I would rather say, that we're facing now is, yes, we know what we want to do now, but do we know what kind of end state we can agree to? And that's a problem for everyone.
Yeah.
You can also go to the U.S. and, what's the end state the U.S. look for? Nobody has a clue in Washington, frankly. And in Europe, we're also struggling with this. And that's going to be very important because the end state will also be very informative on how Europe will position itself towards China. So I think it's going to be difficult for Europeans to agree 100% to how we're going to deal with China before we understand how will we deal with Russia in the post-Ukraine scenario.
Ambassador, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I wish we had more time, but that's all that we have for tonight. Before we go, maybe we'd like to leave a message to our audience?
Well, definitely. And first of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and I love being in the Philippines. I see a lot of opportunities for the Philippines. I think the Philippines has moved much more into the focus of Europe, of Denmark. The Philippines has a great baseline potential, but there's also work to be done. Cut the red tape, you have to deal with governance issues. You get those things right, I see a great future for the Philippines. Your neighbors have had their decades. It's the Philippines' turn now. Let's make this decade the Filipino decade. Thank you.
Very well said, Ambassador. Again, thank you very much. I'd like to thank also our viewers watching this program live and those watching the replay. And I'd like to thank Pastor Apollo Kibuloy for making this program possible. This has been Business and Politics, and I will see you next week. Thank you, Your Excellency.
Rescue ang 10 katao matapos sumiklab ang
Pagsuko kahapon ng 3 miyembro ng CBP-NPA.
Aprobado na sa House Committee.
sa panayam ng SMNI News.
Pag ang totoo ay totoo, lilitaw talaga yan.
Anong gusto mong kainin sa birthday mo?
Gusto ko makakain kahit anong palibong. Ice cream. Strawberry. Sopas. Spaghetti.